Storm to Restoration, Quantifying Secondary Succession in Point Pleasant Park by Rory, Finn, and Grace. We acknowledge that this land has been stewarded by the Mi'kmaq people since time immemorial and remains governed by the treaties of peace and friendship. Disturbance plays an essential role in ecological structure and function, reshaping community composition and influencing successional trajectories. After Hurricane Juan, which struck Nova Scotia in 2003, significant damage to over 70% of plant life within Point Pleasant Park was caused. It is essential to understand how forest communities respond to these disturbances to provide insight into ecosystem resilience and long-term recovery processes. Measuring biodiversity indices permits researchers to assess the number of species present and also how individuals are distributed among these species. Our study looks at how the plant community in Point Pleasant Park has changed in the years since the hurricane by surveying vegetation across multiple sites and calculating essential biodiversity indices. We aim to evaluate the progression of recovery after Hurricane Juan for a better understanding of post-disturbances dynamics in coastal forests. Before starting this study, we intended to confirm secondary succession in Point Pleasant Park was initiating resulted in measurable changes in forest community structure over time, reflected in increased studied indices.
Tree and ground flora data were collected from a 20 meter by 20 meter forest plot within Point Pleasant Park on the south end of Halifax, Nova Scotia. These methods and figures refer to data collected in 2025, added to the pool data collected since 2004 to accurately interpret long-term progress of succession. The photo on the right corresponds to the different sites and the groups that measured at each site. For tree sampling, all living trees with a diameter at breast height greater than 2.5 centimeters were measured and species identified using iNaturalist and textbook resources. DBH was measured 4.5 feet above the ground using standard DBH tape for consistency and comparing individuals of different sizes, and measurements were repeated when needing to ensure accuracy. Ground flora was evaluated within each study site using 1 meter square quadrat wooden frames. Quadrat placement was determined by throwing a colored object over the shoulder into the sampling area, and the point where the object landed indicated the center of the quadrat. The object was then thrown repeatedly from the same location until all assigned quadrats were completed, which was 12 total per area per sampling year. For estimating percent cover, ground flora species within each quadrat were identified, assigned a percent cover value, and recorded on a standardized data sheet using different ecological procedures. The first procedure is estimation of ground flora by visualizing percent cover area. So you can see each box in the first figure represents a different percent cover. The second is estimation of ground flora by sequentially adding each individual or clump to the overall percent value. As shown compared to the first figure, you can assign a percent cover value for each clump and add it to the total, which is about 38% for the second figure. And then the third is estimating ground flora by visually grouping plant material into a single area and visualizing percent cover area, which compared to the first figure is about 35%.
In Figure 7, we see below the depiction of change in biodiversity in Point Pleasant Park from 2004 to present, looking at the Shannon Index. We see a Y value of 0.055x minus 110, which shows a gradual increase in biodiversity. The R-squared value shows a 0.31. This increase in the Shannon Index suggests this is a result of secondary succession and an increase in overall species diversity and species index evenness the community is seeing, which suggests a development of a more complex ecosystem and is continuing to progress towards its climax community. Continuing on how has and will the community change. The hurricane was a major disturbance event impacting much of the canopy and resetting successional processes. Regeneration studies suggest that native conifers are regenerating and composition is returning that to the pre-disturbed forest. Burley et al. Found that native early successional tree species dominate the seed bank and seedling layers are in disturbed plots. Most importantly, it found the regeneration of Point Pleasant Park is not being limited by invasive species, which is essential for recovery of the native ecosystem. Successional progression is on trajectory for a more mature community. Nilly et al. Similarly found that described the Point Pleasant's forest as a spruce, fir, pine, maple, birch association as an early successional complex of the region prior to the hurricane. It noted that knowing that Point Pleasant Park lies within the Acadian Forest region and is mapped as an early successional association helps in predicting its climax of later successional community. With continued management, the forest will develop and niches will return in which progress towards the climax community expected of the region. As the force recovers, assuming that there is no other major disturbances similar to that of Hurricane Juan, the ecosystem will stabilize. Overcome the coming decades, we expect a gradual restoration of the forest towards a typical climax Acadian forest.
Richness in Point Pleasant Park has steadily increased from 2004 to 2025, following the logical progression of secondary succession. In our data, we saw periods of high richness followed by periods of slightly lower richness, with an overarching upward trend in richness over the last 21 years. This increase came out to 276%. It had a p-value of 2.6 times 10 to the negative 18, indicating significance. As stated by Turk in 2016, as well as Moles and Cahill 2014, this is expected, as secondary succession necessitates some communities being more fit for the environment the community before them created, whilst changing the environment themselves for the next, leading to patterns of establishment and therefore changes in richness, but with an overarching increase as the forest moves towards its climax community. Ecosystems in early stages have low richness because most species were wiped out by the disturbance. Their populations are mostly consisted of a few pioneer species. Late stages of succession, however, have medium-high richness, and that richness is stable, unlike Point Pleasant Park today. Therefore, these results are consistent with the hypothesis that Point Pleasant Park is at the mid-stage of succession, due to the opening of niches with delayed competition and the temporary coexistence of species. As forests approach their climax community, richness peaks and then plateaus or declines as the dynamism of the forest's environment and resources decrease. Mature ecosystems have more aggressive levels of competitive exclusion than ecosystems at earlier stages of succession, because they have more dominant competitors which can retain dominance due to the unchanging environment, as stated by Perry 1995. Therefore, according to our hypothesis that Point Pleasant Park is currently at the mid-stage of succession, we can predict species richness to continue to rise in the next decade, until it reaches late-stage succession and its climax community, where it will then stabilize or slightly decrease as the ecosystem progresses to its endpoint. Here I have included a mock-up of the projected richness over the next decade based on the earlier graph from 2025 as an example of Point Pleasant Park's near future.
We also evaluated the density of dominant species over time. The figure summarizes the long-term trend in red spruce density from 2004 to 2025 in Point Pleasant Park as a result following hurricane disturbance in secondary succession. Figure 1 suggests red spruce abundance remains relatively low across sampling years, but the regression suggests a weak yet significant positive trend with a slope of about 0.34 and a regression of 13%. As a result, RS has recovered gradually after the hurricane, which aligns with studies by Hessler over Berg and Sass, showing that conifers typically return later in succession. Since the slope is positive and the p-value is below 0.05, we reject the null hypothesis that year has no effect on RS density and conclude that RS density has increased slowly but significantly over time. For the current most dominant species in Point Pleasant Park, the figure presents changes in red maple density from 2004 to 2025. RM densities increase more sharply than RS, with many data points reaching high values such as 40 to 80 individuals per 400 meters square. The regression in Figure 2 shows a strong and statistically significant positive trend in RM density over time, with a slope of about 2.24 and a regression of 14%. This increase aligns with earlier studies by Z and Keyes that predict increasing hardwood dominance in Point Pleasant Park following Hurricane Juan. Because the slope is positive and the p-value is below 0.05, we reject the null hypothesis that year has no effect on RM density and conclude that RM density has significantly increased throughout the sampling period. Using results obtained from 20 years of Point Pleasant Park data, we can compare densities of dominant species to show how these values have changed over time following hurricane disturbance and secondary succession. In 2004, the dominant species across the sampled area was red spruce with 1 to 7 individuals per 400 meters square, and red maple was largely absent. By 2024, the dominant species had shifted to red maple with 2 to 59 individuals, while red spruce increased slightly in density with 3 to 23 individuals. These results suggest a large shift from a conifer-dominant community in 2004 to a hardwood-dominated community by 2024, as red maple becomes the most abundant species. The overall trend suggests that RM will likely remain dominant as the forest moves towards its climax community, as it is favored by open, highly disturbed conditions, and RS will continue to increase as shaded conditions and canopy structures are restored. In the future, Point Pleasant Park should shift from a hardwood-dominated forest towards a more mixed hardwood conifer community as conditions become more favorable for late successional species.
Based on the trends in our data from 2004 to 2025, as well as the current literature on succession theory, we can predict that Point Pleasant Park is in the mid-stage of succession in 2025. With high richness and high relative abundance of species, Point Pleasant Park has low competitive exclusion, consistent with middling stages of succession. Furthermore, red maple traditionally dominates early mid-stages, while red spruce increases in frequency at later stages. In Point Pleasant Park today, red maple is the leading tree, reinforcing our hypothesis. We also see the beginnings of an increase in spruce frequency. While red maple dominance immediately suggests the beginning stages of mid-succession, we know from the Point Pleasant Park management plan that red maple was highly cultivated by humans due to its higher resistance to hurricanes. Because of the trends in a richness and abundance of species, we believe that the human planting of red maple on the southeastern bank post-Hurricane John led to red maple retaining dominance for a little longer than natural. Indeed, the succession of urban parks is different to that of natural forests, with species often being prioritized or removed artificially, changing the logical process of succession. Furthermore, the death and subsequent fall of vegetation to the forest floor is instrumental in the initiation of further successional stages. However, Point Pleasant encourages human recreation, and therefore culls or supports weak trees, once again influencing succession. The Mi'kmaq concept of Natuqua Mink may be a better option for aiding Point Pleasant Park's recovery. In this case, Natuqua Mink can be translated as doing only what you have to. In other words, Point Pleasant Park's management may find value in maintaining the park by mimicking natural disturbances and refraining from significantly altering the park's ecological integrity. Park maintenance that minimizes influencing succession may aid in cultivating a mature and healthy Nova Scotian forest.
Animals play an important role in forest succession by helping forests recover after disturbance. Small organisms disperse seeds and move nutrients through the ecosystem, supporting early regrowth. DFO 2018 highlights how herbivores, including deer, rodents, and insects, also determine seedling survival by selectively feeding on certain species. Furthermore, soil-disturbing animals can also create small areas of exposed soil for germination. In Point Pleasant Park, animals influence recovery after Hurricane Juan by helping deliver seeds into storm-open gaps and feeding affected which young trees established. Overall, animals helped guide the park's post-hurricane forest succession.
As temperatures rise and an increase of rain snow is experienced, some trees may experience less growth and species currently thriving in the park could decline, while invasive species that are more heat tolerant may thrive, potentially completely altering the composition of the forest. Climate change can lead to more disturbances like natural disasters, pests, and disease. These disturbances can disrupt existing forest structures and accelerate successional processes, potentially resulting in a quicker growing species dominating the early succession stages like Hurricane Juan. Changes in temperature and moisture from the increased precipitation can change growth rates and plant life. Greater temperatures may extend the growing season, but potential droughts could affect growth, changing the rate of succession. The changing climate's influence on the current ecosystem in Point Pleasant Park will be unpredictable, but will likely influence biodiversity, dominant species, and the increase of an invasive species, carbon storage, and changing growth rate. But the most likely effect will be an increase of disturbances like Hurricane Juan.
Point Pleasant's geography exacerbated the disturbance intensity of Hurricane John in comparison to other Nova Scotian forests. Point Pleasant Park was in the direct path of the storm and was hit for much longer and with more intensity than forests that lay out of the path of the eye. Furthermore, Point Pleasant is a peninsula surrounded on three sides by the Atlantic Ocean, and its increased coastal exposure led to the park being hit immediately when John struck the hurricane harbor, with no time for the storm to have been weakened first by surrounding land. The storm surge in the contained harbor included 9-meter waves that struck Point Pleasant Park directly, causing coastal erosion of its banks and destabilizing the southeastern shore. Cape Breton Highlands National Park was also affected by Hurricane Jean, but in the same time frame is now dominated by climax species like American beech and sugar maple, illustrating the different geographic impacts made on Point Pleasant Park's succession.